I am Asha Dore, and this is Totally Biased Reviews with Laura Bogart.
Hi, I thank you very much. I'm Laura Bogart. I am the author of Don't You Know I Love You, which came out in March 2020 from Dzanc Books. Uh, I've written for Dame, I've written for Vulture, I have had a piece in The Atlantic, and I also do TV reviews for Prime Timer. And that is where you can find me. You can also find me at LD Bogart on Twitter. I will never call it X. I think that's the only, yeah, we'll never call it X. And you can also find me at laurabogart.net on ye old internet.
Your book actually came out in March of
Yes.
2020, right?
It came out March 17th, 2020. And so the story about that, this was the time when COVID was like, oh, it's this weird bug going around, and we're all gonna be working from home for 2 weeks. And we all kind of, those of us who weren't on the front lines of it, thought we were relatively insulated. And I remember like some of my events getting initially like postponed, or oh, we'll reschedule in April. And then it was becoming very apparent that this was not going to be just an overnight thing or a 2 week thing. When I say all of this, I want to be clear and I want to be respectful of the fact that like there were so many tragedies going on during COVID, people, becoming debilitated with long COVID, people dying, people losing family. So I spin all of my own tale of book debut woe, fully admitting that it is but a drop in the bucket of what other people went through at that time. But I remember literally I was going to have a opening or an initial reading, a kickoff at this bookstore that was really near my house. I loved it. The house at the time. I loved it. I loved that bookstore, and it just had to get canceled. And so I remember literally driving up the day it came out, staring at my book through the glass of the bookstore. I had my dog with me, and I'm just like, hi, book. So that was my debut. I'm also extremely grateful to the literary community that rallied around those of us who had these debuts out and books out at that time, and made a point of inviting us to the podcasts and events and stuff over Zoom. I wish we did more events over Zoom to help people who can't, get spaces physically. But there's a difference, right? There, especially when it's your first book and you don't have that experience. And, you know, I was devastated by it. It definitely colored my experience of putting out a book. I mean, for a minute, it almost didn't feel like I had, because I didn't get that like big debut author thing. And I had like, a lot of dates planned for the East Coast. And I'd worked really hard to secure promo, and, it was well reviewed. People liked it. And so I had to kind of really overcome that. And I had a moment, I want to say it was maybe 2022. I had a piece in an anthology, and I was reading at the bookstore where my book would have been. And the woman who was reading with me at that event, she was extremely kind. And she was like, you know what? If you want to read some of the book that got kind of, overshadowed by COVID, you can go ahead. And so I did get to read that book in front of people at that store 2 years later. And that was like kind of a healing, yeah, it was a very healing and cathartic experience. And the bookstop is the Ivy in Baltimore, by the way.
Oh, I can imagine that
Yeah.
that would be healing on a lot of levels. Some of the worst parts of COVID were the quiet losses. There were like big ones that were obvious, but like I
Yes.
was more impacted when I realized that I couldn't kind of meditate while driving anymore and pick up snacks for
Yeah.
myself in between jobs.
We lost routine. We lost a lot in that time. And I think that time also revealed a lot about the lack of compassion that people have for each other too.
Yeah.
But also the compassion that people had. So it's like kind of both. But absolutely, the quiet losses, that's the perfect way to put it.
Well, I wonder how long it took you to write this book, but I imagine it was not a quick experience because
Nope.
nobody really reads a book fast. And I feel
Mm-mm.
like, I haven't had my debut book out yet. Like I have a couple books on submission right now, and I'm just like
Oh,
I can't imagine the day that I get to actually read from a published book, right? It's like one of
yeah.
those things. And so to have that just kind of to be locked out of that, that must have really sucked.
This book had kind of an odyssey to publication. I started the book kind of off and on around like 2012-ish, I think. And I was writing, pop culture essays at the time and working on this intermittently. And then I like really drilled down into it, finished it in like 2015, 2016. And we went out on submission in the summer of 2016. And so the book is basically, like I say, the book, Don't You Know I Love You, the main character, I sort of like to say that she is kind of like if the James Dean character from Rebel Without a Cause was a woman, was a young girl. So if you like super angsty young women, she has that kind of, that is very much an influence on the book Rebel Without a Cause and James Dean in particular, because there's a certain type of rage and sort of disaffectedness that male characters get to have and women don't. Or if they do, it is very much funneled into this experience of being angry in a marriage or being angry about motherhood, or being angry about kind of, certain things around men. And I was like, well, this is a young queer woman who's just angry about family situations, angry about trying to make it as an artist, and, trying to kind of figure some things out for her own life. And so we took it out on submission, and then it was like fall of 2016. And then we all know what happened in the fall of 2016. And hopefully it will not happen again. But so at that point, then it just felt like, it was just so hard to place this book that was, I kind of say it's like if you like 90s indie films, that's
Mm-hmm.
kind of the vibe of the book.
Mm-hmm.
And so, angry young queer woman, working class, plus size, 90s indie film vibe. And it just, we tried really hard, and it did eventually land at Dzanc in like 2019. So this book was out on submission to publishers for about 3 years.
Oof.
And I'm always extremely transparent about that, because I think we always hear these stories of like, oh well, my book was on submission for the agents for like a month, and then I sold, and then it went to auction at the big house. And we only hear the kind of big instant success stories.
Mm-hmm.
And I also find, a lot of the kind of literary community marketing, the kind of big literary push behind certain books, and you see them everywhere, it only goes to a handful of titles. And it's always, sort of a cool kids club, if I may say. It has become that, or it feels like that. And a lot of other stories and the stories around those stories don't get to be told as often. And so I'm very transparent. This took 3 years before it found a home in Dzanc.
Mm-hmm.
And I love, Dzanc was a wonderful publisher. They definitely took a risk on this book, but and they published it, and nobody could have foreseen the time frame that it came out in. So
Mm-hmm.
it's an angsty book in all ways.
For it to land, I feel like the
Yeah.
community of books at this press are so, I
Yeah.
mean, I always buy them. I just
Mhm.
trust these books. The language is so specific for each
Oh, yeah.
author. I really enjoy so many things about this book, but I love your
You.
like word choice and language, and I feel like
Oh,
that's just always something I can trust from that press. They're really good at finding writers like you who are very specific and voice, to me, like kind of voice driven, and I can see
yes.
that vibe and the character through the way that you wrote this. And it's really I'm sad that it came out in March of 2020.
I am too. I am too. I spend a lot of time and care on my prose. One of the most formative writers for me was Mary Gateskill. The way that woman weaves a sentence, and it'll be the most kind of image that is like lush and vivid and beautiful, but also like grotesque.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Um, like, and I admit, I some of her books I prefer more than others, but I don't know if you've read Because They Wanted to, the short story collection. There is an image in that book. This woman is thinking about her lover's new girlfriend, and she says, I intuit, and I remember parts of it, I don't remember the full sentence, but it's something like, I intuited her vagina, a rude little girl that would have stuck out its tongue if it could. I think that's the exact line, actually. Who thinks of stuff like that? That's the kind of stuff that she plays with language. And so I always push myself. Sometimes I'll be writing and I'll be like, no, you can do harder than that. You can push harder. You can do more. You can take it to another place.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I think that's the best part of writing. It's like that you can just
Mm-hmm.
kind of all by yourself go like, maybe she didn't just sit down. Like something else
Yes.
happened there. Um,
Yeah, well, yeah, because it's like there's so much that can be conveyed in gesture, right? Because it's like if she sits down, that's one thing, but if she slumps in the chair,
mhm,
that's another. Or, if she sits down with her back erect and her, and eyes ahead, that's a whole different thing. Like,
mhm.
I feel like there's such economy that you can get out of descriptions, and there's such a versatility that you can get out of descriptions, and I love it.
I agree. I super agree. And it's interesting because I worked with Lydia Yuknovich. She said one time that you know that you're a writer when you stop going to bars and talking about the shit that's in your head and you just do it on the
Yep,
page.
yep.
And I think that is such a wonderful way of doing it. And it shows through. I've been lucky to have a lot of conversations about like woman or girl anger in these
Hmm.
reviews. And I think it's such an important unexplored thing. I love what you said earlier about how we usually frame it in this, marriage or motherhood
Hmm.
anger thing. That's so true.
And it doesn't represent, there are a lot of women who are outside of that experience. I'm 40, I'm 42 now as of the 4th.
Mhm.
And I am gay. I live alone. I'm fine with that. I'm not going to be any man's wife. I'm not going to have children. So I look at a lot of the material that's about women's rage, and it is very heterosexual, very middle class, and it is very skewed in this experience of mothers, in particular mothers of young children. And I don't mean to dismiss or demean that experience at all, but you're right. It is seen as the entry point for stories about women. And I know for myself, a lot of the dialogue about like women's rage, it makes me feel a little bit excluded because it is so oriented around this kind of very heteronormative life experience that I'm not going to have.
That tracks for me because I also feel like thinking about your character, that's not explored very often, young women, and just like how if we're not upset by our like wanting for men, then
Mm-hmm.
what do we have to be upset about?
Yes.
And it's
Yes.
just like the complexity of that and how we don't have a whole lot of language for it outside of these lanes that do exclude most of our experiences.
And it was important to me, and it's funny because I wrote this book before I came out to myself. And so I kind of think in some ways this book was like something in the back of my brain because it is, she's openly, I don't know, I don't always love the term openly, or is anyone openly straight? But like, she is out, she knows this of herself. And part of me wonders if something in the back of my brain was going, because I was like, I don't want to read another book about like a woman who's out there like dating, that being a sort of quintessential 20 something Sex in the City sort of experience. Like, I'm not interested in that. That wasn't really my life. So this is someone who is a working class artist. She's angry that she can't get traction with her art. She's angry. She has an injury at the beginning of the book. She's broken her wrist, and that impacts her livelihood and her ability to earn, to be an artist. And she has to kind of figure out a work around that and to be inspired. And our stories are so much more complicated than a lot of kind of mainstream stories are,
I agree. I like that you also brought up that she's a working class artist, and she has to like
Mm-hmm.
move back in with her parents. That whole experience, I think we often don't read about artists of
No.
any gender who are actually just working class. That
Mm-hmm.
concept, it even didn't track for me. Like I've always done my art as an unpaid labor. Even though it's obvious, it just never occurred to me that I could actually have gainful employment with my art and writing. So I've like always, like shuffled it off like, well, I'll get my graduate degree in something that I can make money with. I think we're trained to either do the traditional mommy wife thing or work our asses off and do everything, but
Yes.
never just focus on art.
Well, and that's exactly it, right? Because it's either like you're girl bossing into the sun,
Mm-hmm.
which my character's not interested in. I'm not particularly interested in either. Or, it's this other lane. And it's like all of the literature, especially contemporary literature about artists, they're all kind of like people who have affluence, or they're subsidized by their parents, but they're not in a position where they have to like move back in. I think to some degree, some of that's fantastical, and almost people kind of wanting to like have this like little fantasy of themselves and their lives. I wasn't particularly interested in that with this book. Like I was like, this is a very resonant story for me, because I was working day jobs, I was freelancing like crazy, writing. I mean, part of the reason it took me like 4 years to do this book, beyond kind of the mechanics of trying to figure out how it is you're going to write a book, bills have to be paid.
And I appreciate you for doing that because I do think escapism and the publishing
Mm-hmm.
industry, there's such a push for that. And
Yeah.
it takes a fair amount of grit or something,
Yep.
stubbornness, I don't know, to like just be like, no, I'm actually going to write the story that I want to write. And that's resonant for a lot of people that, you know, maybe don't want to escape, but maybe want to understand.
Yeah, it's sad, but then also I don't know about you, but sometimes when I see all these stories and it just, people like I said, girl bossing into the sun. Now it's funny. Now I'm interested in stories about people who are in middle age, because I am middle age. But I don't want to read something and feel shitty. And I think escapism has its time and its place, but sometimes it feels like it's like getting a glut of like candy,
Hmm.
and there's no actual kale or steak or nutrient inside all of it. Like I said, I like candy,
Hmm.
but when everything getting pushed on book talk is this, then I don't know that it does anybody any good. And I think we're also at a point, because we're not being challenged kind of culturally. I think this is also with like movies, TV. I think this is media in general. We're at a point where people are, kind of extremely, like excruciatingly literal. I saw a tweet today or something. They're talking about kind of the diminishing of like cultural conversation. They're saying basically nobody wants to read anything that could like really like impact them emotionally, or watch anything that really can impact them emotionally. And so there's self protection, which is one thing, but now we're just at a stage where it's like nobody wants to be challenged or provoked.
Or to only be challenged and provoked in the ways that are kind of sanctioned right now. I'm going to unpack this backpack, but the other ones are going to stay zip the fuck up.
Exactly. Emma Copley Eisenberg just did a really beautiful essay. It was for the New Republic.
Hmm.
And it was about body size and literature. And it was talking about how, even in serious literary fiction that's out there now, there's a lot of like sizeism, there's a lot of ableism. And it's people, she name checks people like Lauren Groff and Jonathan Franzen, but so it's like we can unpack all these other aspects of the experience, but like exactly like you said, leave other ones unchecked
Hmm.
or unopened. And that was also part of the reason like I made my heroine plus size too. I think you have to push. You have to push for the things you want to see.
I think that your point about nutrients versus candy is really valid because I
Mm-hmm.
think we actually want to understand various experiences. We just, when we only get like a chunk of experiences, we're like,
Yeah.
okay, a lot of people I think are just like, yeah, I like this because it's what I'm receiving. But like,
Mm-hmm.
I want to know about experiences that are different from mine.
Like I'm part of a book club, and we just read Dancer from the Dance by Andrew Holleran, and like it's gay men in the 70s, and it could not be more removed from the lifestyle that I live now. And it is also like very interestingly concerned with like class and money, because at a certain point, it's like the main character has to start like doing, he's a hustler, and he becomes that because he has to like make rent. And I was like, man, I'm trying to remember the last time that was like a driving concern of like a piece
Yeah.
of like literary fiction. that I read. I mean, the book is beautiful. It's beautifully written. It's like it's so far outside of my life experience.
And it's wonderful. It's interesting too when somebody might look or have a very different life than us, but we find these points of resonance because of
Yes.
the struggles. I dog ear the hell out of my books. I'm like a bad reader, but there's this one scene like right in the middle of your book where Angelina's driving Janet and she's like speeding and she's
Mm-hmm.
telling herself like you won't be like your dad, you're not going to like push it until you kind of like scare your passenger. After I read that I was like, "Oh my God, like thank you." Because that's such a thing that nobody ever fucking admits, that they're
Yes.
like doing a shitty thing. They're aware they're doing a shitty thing. They can even
Mm-hmm.
maybe connect it in the moment to a shitty thing that they like, learned from somebody that they don't, whose behavior they don't particularly like that much. And yet
Mm-hmm.
we still do it. And we're like fighting with that drive in a really intellectual way. And probably if we got called out on it, we would be like, that's not happening right now.
Yep.
This character's life is really different from mine. Like I'm not a working artist with an injury right now,
Mm-hmm.
That point of resonance is there. And I think that's kind of the point of
Yeah.
literature, is finding the nuanced intersections that again the wider cultural conversation just like refuses to acknowledge.
Yeah. And thank you. That was one of the scenes where I'm like, okay, like, I'm trying to push this, and it, because that's the challenge of this young woman, is it's just, she has these two different worldviews that are presented to her. One is of community, of creativity, and one is, her father's the most domineering figure in her life, and um he is modeled with her power begets power. Like that's his model. And she's trying to kind of break herself of the habit. And it's, I think we all have those things that we have learned, and those cultural messages, family messages, cultural messages, um, all the stuff that is, we're supposed to learn and unlearn about who we are and how we should act in the world.
Yeah, I can see that. The dad character is really interesting to me in your book. And I was thinking about it because I'm like, I really like books with this tone. And I don't even know, like, I wonder how you describe the tone. Like, for me, I'm like, it's kind of a little bit of like sad funny, but then there's a little bit of like, oh, snap funny. Like when she finds the dog, the kids are being like awful.
She's a defender of animals. To everyone listening, if you like, the dog is okay. I'm going to spoil
Yeah.
my own book for everyone who's listening. Like, the dog is cool and the dog is okay. I'm a dog lover.
Yes, me too, me too. She like yells at those kids. I think she cusses at them, right?
She cusses at them. She like threatens them. They're like bothering this dog. And she has this like violent protective urge to save the dog.
Love it. Like, and it's hilarious and like super serious, but
Yeah.
it's like that oh snap funny. It's like, oh shit, she just did that,
Mm-hmm. Oh no, she's like basically, yeah, because she does that, and she has this moment with where it's like that's the rage that she has, and it's like rage can be used for good purposes too.
Mhm.
But then afterwards she has the dog, and the dog's like, so what are we gonna do? And she's like, I don't know, shit. Oh no, I think humor is such a valuable storytelling tool, and I think people act like humor doesn't have tone to it, or there aren't like tonal variances to humor, but there is totally a difference between, yeah, there's funny sad, which I love that tone. I like really try to cleave into it as much as I can. And then there's like oh snap funny, and sometimes there's just like genuinely like bizarre funny. Yeah.
These kinds of stories must have humor in order to carry you through so that you can like
Oh, definitely.
explain especially like with anger. I feel like anger and humor are like best friends in
Oh, they have to
literature.
be. I mean,
Yes.
sometimes like darkness and humor are like the best things.
When he's like so excited about the dog coming to his
Mm-hmm.
house, there's something like dark about that, but it's so weird. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, I know that guy. Like, I know that guy
Mm-hmm.
won't connect with
Yeah.
human beings, but is just like gonna obsess over, whatever, some little thing, that they really get
Mm-hmm.
excited about.
Well, and it's funny because father is like this, like, just very working class, temperamental, abusive, but, also charming in his way when he wants to be. And, he can't say anything to his daughter. He can't like apologize to his daughter for how he was with her when she was younger. But he's like, I can make it up with this dog.
Hmm.
Like, I can be like the best dog grandpa on the planet and like make it up to her through this dog. And so, and I did think about that too, because like creating a character like the father, Jack, I know one of your questions was like, who would play him,
Mhm. Mhm.
like, or who would play people in the, it would be like a Jeffrey Dean Morgan or a Nicolas Cage, type. I really was like wanting to be very careful because I'm like, if he's so hateable from the jump, nobody's going to be invested, and especially in reading his point of view chapters. And so I was like, I have to consciously do things that will kind of endear him or make him complex.
Mhm. Yeah, I love that. And I love that you brought that up because I think that's a point of craft that is so often
Mm-hmm.
one lost on the reader. Like I think readers just like gobble that up without, thinking
Yeah.
too about all the work that goes into that.
Nicolas Cage would be a good Jack. Christina Hendricks would be the mom, Marie.
Perfect.
As for Angelina, so it's hard, right? Because she's a plus size character. And unfortunately, we don't have, like, I was really kind of racked with this. And I'm like, there's not a lot of like young plus size women for me to
Wow.
think of in terms of like, there's like Nicola Coughlan, who is like the young woman from Bridgerton. And I don't know if I mean, I've never seen her do an American accent, but if
Hmm.
she could, I think she's got the range. She's clearly like really smart and awesome and witty.
And what a really illuminating thing. Because it's true. I
Mm-hmm.
realized that like I was picturing somebody that I like met a long time ago when I lived in Atlanta, like a acquaintance, like that was like that person was the character
Oh wow.
in my head. Like I just like, because it's like I don't know, when I read books, I like give pictures to the
I do
characters.
too. I
And it's
do
usually
too.
like a mush of like people I've met and actors and like whatever. Like they just
Oh, I
become
do too.
um but she just like reminded me, I guess, of this person. And so it's like who I imagined as I was reading it. How
Mm,
unfortunate that it's
yeah.
2024 and that's the state that we're in, where we can like only think of a couple of people who are actually young and also plus size. Like, what the fuck?
Mhm. No, that's like literally it. Because I was sitting there thinking, like, I love this question because I love film, I love TV. Like I think about actors often when I write fiction.
Mm-hmm.
And I, use that in my mind. And so, but I was sitting there thinking, like, I cannot actually think of anyone who would play her in an ideal world where this book became wildly successful in like 2017, and I did a tour, and I, was on crying on Oprah's couch, and it was optioned right away, and we had Nicolas Cage and we had Christina Hendricks. They would have given it to like Kristen Stewart, like,
Yeah.
just because. And even though I mean, although I loved Love Lies Bleeding, I can't say she's not a brilliant actor, but like, yeah, that says it. It's 24, it's 2024, and I can't really think of anybody.
If anybody ever listens to this who is in the industry, like, fix that
Yeah,
shit. Fix
yeah,
it
fix it
now.
now. Fix it
Yeah.
now. I mean, to some degree, it gets a little bit better, but now everything's like the Ozempic kick and stuff, and
It's like we know that it's not the only thing that people want to see and desire. So why do we keep focusing on this obsession with thinness?
it's linked to capitalism because if you can keep people in that cycle of being desperately unhappy with themselves for whatever reason, but
Hmm.
desperately unhappy with themselves, they will buy the drugs. They will buy and I don't dismiss people that need Ozempic medically. I don't, or other drugs medically. I certainly would never do that. Um, but it keeps people in an unhealthy cycle of like yo-yo dieting or profound dissatisfaction, and there's money in making people feel undesirable. And I do think it's also modes of control for women and femme presenting people. And I'm not going to say I'm not immune from it, and I'm certainly not going to say that I'm at ease with my own, we're all in a process, right?
Hmm.
And in the book, like, Angelina is plus size, her lover partner Janet is thin, is conventionally attractive, and she does have some issues around that,
Hmm.
and some intense insecurities that bubble out over it. um and so that was another kind of aspect that I wanted to talk about, just having bodies and all of the kind of weird social shit that goes on with it.
I love the way that they like mirror each other and work as foils for each
Mm-hmm.
other's issues, and also just like who has permission to have and show anger. I think is a really
Mm-hmm.
interesting question that's in this book. What kind of feedback makes it possible for us to express ourselves, and what, kind of
Mm-hmm.
feedback makes us feel like we have to hide inside of whatever shell we're creating for
Mm-hmm.
ourselves. I think that there's a lot of that in the book, and I really appreciate the dad character too, because I feel like he is just unabashedly, you
Oh,
know,
he's yeah.
pissed off all the like often, a lot.
He has the privilege. He has the privilege to do it. Like he
Mhm.
totally can get away with doing it because he's white, male, and also good looking too. Like and
Mhm.
conventionally attractive. And so yeah, that's all there.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot in there about permission too, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I appreciate that a lot.
What I hope people will find in it, if the idea of permission, like you said, like if they read it and just feel a little bit less alone or like a little bit more like they have permission to be themselves, if it's loud, if it's messy, if it's angry, if it's fat, if it's thin, if it's whatever, like be that, just don't hurt other people. Like don't willfully hurt other people. And so I'm gonna be like, don't be like the dad. Don't
Yeah.
don't be like the dad.
Yeah,
Or the
well,
mom who's an enabler.
awesome. Are you working on a new book right now?
So I am working on two different projects right now. One is I'm working on a proposal for an essay collection, which is it's about a variety of things. It is about me coming out later in life. It is about having lived with chronic pain and having had a hysterectomy to relieve me of the chronic pain and going to perimenopause earlier. So it's kind of queerness, body, reclaiming joy, also finding that there are multiple ways to define yourself as fertile. And I'm also working on a kind of magical realist novel that I would say it is a gender swapped version of that borrows from the Greek myth of Aphrodite and Hephaestus.
Ooh, fun. I love that.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. And there's going to be lots of fat sex and sensuality and humor in that in that book too.
Yeah, I love both of those. You want to do a reading?
I just opened to chapter 6, which is literally talking about all the rejection that she gets, and I'm just
Awesome.
like, oh shit, okay.
Good.
Sorry, Angelina, this is what we're doing. Her inbox was a catalog of rejections. She sent her slides, still lives and portraits rendered photorealistically, impressionistically, in savage expressionism and perfect cubism, in all the styles she'd had to learn and through all her years of schooling, to agencies in DC and New York, and just for the hell of it, San Francisco, because she'd always wanted to live someplace warm. The rejections they sent her, when the rejections came in written form and not just a void, said that her work didn't exemplify brand standards or lacked provocativeness and the sense of play that distinguishes us as a thought leader in creative solutions across industries. The latter type of rejection, surprisingly, stung her. She could laugh at the corporatees, but she suspected that the inference that she lacked vision could be true. She was not Robert Mapplethorpe, showing photographs of a bullwhip up his asshole in a New York loft, or Frida Kahlo, fucking Trotsky and Josephine Baker while painting the savage poetry of her body. She wasn't O'Keeffe in the desert or Patti Smith scrawling reams of poetry in the Chelsea Hotel. She was lying on a sofa bed in her parents' basement, watching the ceiling tremble under their footsteps. She couldn't even get her work in the crappy cafe in the basement of a converted row home on Preston Street that also housed, on the top floor, a vendor of essential oils and a psychic who didn't replace her window sign, even though the P and the S had long since burned out. This was one of the last places she tried after she'd been waitlisted or outright denied the spaces where she would have actually wanted her work to be shown. The New York galleries, sure, she expected them to pass her over, though of course there was a tiny wire of hope humming in some tin chamber of her heart. The Baltimore venues, waterfront galleries, and coffee shops whose websites featured that typewriter font that Angelina knew to be played out and pretentious, but still loved for its retro preciousness, surprised her. Then again, there were so many talented and industrious people in the same zip code, and they all had their own styles and visions. Yeah.
Yay. Thank you.
Yeah.
I
You're
love it.
welcome. Oh,
Mhm.
and the book is also set in Baltimore. So it's like one of the stories that is set in Baltimore is not set in like California or New York. So if you would like a vision of Baltimore, that is also it.
I loved that. My mom's family is from Baltimore and I love
Oh,
Baltimore. And yeah, it's a special city. It's a special city. Thank you for doing this with me.
no, I just want to, honestly, putting out any book in any way, it's really a challenge. And this in particular was really hard and heartbreaking. And I did have a lot of people that I knew uh, like who were going through this with me. My friend Alana Masad, their book, All My Mother's Lovers, I think, but the author's name is Alana Masad. They were a great source of comfort. We had mutual comfort, so I would, give them a shout out. A lot of the people, we all went through this together, and I really value the friends that I've made and the people that have supported this book. Especially you, even years down the line. Like I would encourage that. And I would also encourage people to remember, even if, you put something out and it doesn't initially do what you want, books have legs. They have ways to grow. And I've had people casually mention to me, oh, I've read your book. I've seen this, whatever. And it's like, holy shit, like really? Out like in the wild, people will say that to you. So like always have faith, no matter how small seemingly a book is or you think its impact might be. You never know. So just have hope, people. Have hope, people of the world.